Okay, we can go ahead and get started. I'm sorry, I have to announce that I have some work happening on my house, and so I'm sorry if there's banging behind me. But I'm Annika Lefebvre. I am the Food Systems Resilience Coordinator with the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, and this is the Weekly Communication and Coordination Committee Legislative Monitoring Call. If you could, please go ahead and put your name and affiliation in the chat to introduce yourselves. We would appreciate it. We are going to start taking roll at committees just for voting members at committee meetings. If that's okay with everyone, it shouldn't take too long, but there's a slide for that in a moment. First, I will turn it over to Heather to introduce herself.
Great, thanks, Annika. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Heather Breskin. I am one of the appointed members of the FSRC and currently serving as chair of the CNC committee. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We are chugging along in the Maryland General Assembly session, and we have a couple of new bills to discuss today, in addition to lots of updates on bills that we've already discussed to share, as well as some insight on the budget process as it moves forward as well. So I appreciate everybody being here, and I look forward to and encourage your input and perspective and sharing highlights of what your own agencies and organizations are engaged in this year's session. So thanks.
Thanks, Heather. Okay, very quickly, we're just going to run through this. Heather is here. Michelle Caruso, do we have you here?
Here. Hi.
Hi, Senator Katie Hester. Okay, I saw LaMonica Jones join. Dr. Lansing. Steve McHenry. Nancy Nunn.
Here.
Hi, Nancy. Dr. Camille Range. And Diana Taylor, I know, is here. So those are just our voting members. That's all we'll do for roll call. Thanks for bearing with me, everybody. So just a few announcements. Distribution and Access is meeting this Thursday at 1 p.m. for those who can make it. Communication and Coordination will be meeting again next Monday, March 3rd at the same time. We hope to see you there. Environment and Production will be meeting again on March 13th. And then the next full FSRC meeting is going to be on April 17th. That will be a full session overview for council members, but Communication and Coordination will also be having their own version of a debrief earlier in that week. But please feel free to reach out with any questions regarding any FSRC matters, and then I'll turn it over to Ben to get us started.
Thank you, Annika. Let me just pull up PowerPoint. Okay, so we are chugging along in our legislative session. Just a reminder of the link to our tracking sheet, which is being updated daily, as well as our tracking calendar for committee hearings. There have been a lot of committee hearings over the past couple of weeks since this committee last met. So I'm going to try and just brief out what happened to some of our priority bills in those committee hearings. And we've also seen action on some of the bills that we've talked about in previous calls. So after we go over the two bills that we're going to discuss today, I'll get into the disposition of some of those other pieces of legislation that we've already discussed. So two bills for today. The first is House Bill 1449, sponsored by Delegate Szeliga, along with a bunch of other mostly Republican legislators. And this has to do with direct-to-consumer sale of raw milk for human consumption. So it basically sets up a regulatory regime allowing raw milk to be sold for human consumption subject to rigorous state regulations. So a person who wants to sell raw milk for human consumption would have to obtain a permit from the Secretary of Health before they sell that milk directly to the consumer. Before that permit is issued, the Secretary shall inspect the dairy farm and ensure it is in compliance. The applicant is required to have a licensed veterinarian examine the animal or herd producing the raw milk. If the applicant doesn't use a public water supply, then the water supply has to be tested, and the applicant has to provide regular documentation to the secretary regarding their ability to produce safe raw milk. Currently, the sale of raw milk is legal in Maryland for non-human consumption, and the sale of raw milk for human consumption is legal in a bunch of different states. So it's not something that's a wholly novel approach here. So I will pause and see if there's any questions on this. The hearing for this bill is on March 10th at 1 p.m. in the House. Annika.
I'm curious, maybe Martin Prue would know. Do we know how many farmers in Maryland currently sell raw milk, like for pet consumption?
That is a number we can get. I don't have that off the top of my head, but of course they'd be registered with our state chemist. So I can get that as a follow-up.
Also, oh, sorry, just to quickly note, this whole regulatory regime does not apply to the sale of raw milk by a dairy farm with 3 or fewer cows or 10 or fewer goats. So it does have to be above that threshold.
And is this only cow's milk or is it goat milk also?
It applies to goat milk as well. Cow's milk and goat's milk. Raw, obviously.
Ben, did you say how many states currently allow for raw milk sales?
I can get you the exact number.
Only if it's easy.
So I believe, let's see, give me just 1 second. So there are a bunch of states where it's retail sales are full-on legal. Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, California, and Alaska. And then there are some states where it's on-farm sales are legal. And Maryland is in the category of states along with Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, New Jersey, and Delaware that allows the sale for pet dairy products, but not for human consumption. Michelle, and good to see you, Michelle.
Hey, Ben, great to see you as well. I have a couple questions, and maybe we don't know yet, but when they say direct to consumer, are they suggesting on-farm sales or some other direct to consumer process? And then who would pay for the inspections, all of the extra regulatory inspections? Are they expecting this Department of Ag to absorb that, or this will be included in the fiscal note for how much that will cost? Or are they suggesting that these licenses will be so expensive as to cover the cost of that? Do you have any knowledge?
That was my interpretation, is that the license cost a fee, and to renew your license is to pay that fee, which would lead to the inspection.
Okay.
So that was the way I read the legislation. In terms of your first question, it mentions dairy farms explicitly. I believe that is the intention because we're talking about direct-to-consumer sales. But I don't want to be quoted on that because I'm not 100% sure.
Nancy?
You're on mute, Nancy. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Mhm.
I just have a really quick question from your first comment. You said it only impacts farms. It does not impact farms with 3 or less animals?
That is correct. So all of this does not apply. Let me go back to the language. to the sale of raw milk by a dairy farm with 3 or fewer cows or 10 or fewer goats?
So I guess maybe this is a question for Martin. Maybe you can answer this for me. Is how are we defining a dairy farm then? Because I mean, is there a number of animals involved? And if someone has 3 or less, how is that milk checked to ensure the safety of that milk? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so two things, Nancy. I think first to your second question, I think this establishes a threshold. At least that's been my understanding of it's not that you're exempt from it, it's that you cannot sell milk if you're falling under that threshold. So they are trying to set some baselines for what would be justified as an operation. But also, I think it's important to note that this is establishing the ability for the state to issue a permit for this type of product. So there's going to be quite a bit of conversation and hashing out what it looks like, very similar to the on-farm processing license and all these other things that in practice exist in statute and need law to pass them. A lot of what is set in stone for how it's regulated is going to be policy changes at that agency level. So it'd have to get passed for a lot of those conversations to really be had. But I do believe that that's what they're trying to do and identify basically in their own definitions of what is a qualified dairy operator.
Okay, thanks.
I have one more. Maybe Martin would know, but do we know like why now for this bill, and if there has been like requests from the agricultural community to enable this kind of permit? Is it related to bird flu?
No, I don't know all of the history. I will say this is the first time I'm familiar with the Maryland Farm Bureau supporting the sale of raw milk. So it, once Farm Bureau is behind it, not that Farm Bureau is asking for something to get introduced, but once it's introduced and it has Farm Bureau's backing, that's probably why you've seen it move the way it's moved thus far.
Thank you.
Other questions? I guess my area of confusion, I wonder if this will come out in the hearing, is about that threshold. The way it seems written to me is that it says this subtitle does not apply to the sale of raw milk by a dairy farm with 3 or fewer cows or 10 or fewer goats. And the entire subsection is about regulations, permitting, etc. So it seems like one could read that as those small farms being exempt. And I don't know if that was the intention, but I assume that'll come out in the hearing.
Ben, I'm curious, does the subtext also enable the sale for human consumption, though?
It does. It does.
So it might be that it's still just not allowed for the below the threshold, but I guess that would have to be assessed out.
Yeah. It's sort of hard to say because it's referring to the subtitle, and the subtitle is very long and contains all of the regulations required for a dairy farm to sell raw milk. So it could just be something in the drafting. It's just an issue to flag.
Thanks, Ben.
Any other questions on this bill? All right. Our beverage theme continues today with a tax on sugary beverages. This is a House Bill 1469, sponsored by Delegate Shetty and Pena-Melnick. So this bill would impose a 2-cent per ounce tax on sugary beverages, and they describe what counts as a sugary beverage. The definition gets a little bit complicated, which I'm not going to go into when we're talking about like powders that can be used to be mixed in with water that creates a sugary beverage. But generally, that type of thing also qualifies as a sugary beverage. The tax would also be imposed on drinks with non-nutritive sweeteners, so aspartame, Diet Coke, that sort of thing. The 2-cent per ounce tax would be increased pursuant to starting in fiscal year 2027, pursuant to the consumer price index. So it would go up with inflation. They are basing their estimate on tax revenue from a similar program in the city of Philadelphia. And they anticipate that this will raise about $400 million in revenue. That revenue will be allocated as follows. First, to just pay for the administration of the tax in the program. And then the first $189 million will be given to the Healthy School Meals for All Fund. The next $50 million to the Child Care Scholarship Program. And then any remaining revenue will go into the general fund. Exceptions for beverages being sold to the U.S. government, so like on U.S. government facilities within the state, like Fort Meade, for example, or to American Indian tribal governments, or for any sale intended for the resale consumption outside of Maryland. And then it also excludes natural fruit juice, natural vegetable juice, milk, infant formula, beverages for medical use, although they clarify that sports drinks are not for medical use. So if you're trying to refill on your electrolytes after a workout and you have a sugary beverage, you're still paying that 2 cents per ounce tax. This is coming for a hearing in the House on March 6th at 1 p.m. And happy to take any questions on it. I will say I've seen news articles that have quoted representatives from the beverage industry saying that they're taking this proposal very seriously. Delegate Pena Melnick is a committee chair in the House, so to have a committee chair co-sponsoring this, I think signifies that the General Assembly is potentially serious about this as a revenue raiser.
Thanks so much, Ben. And I know we have Katie from the American Heart Association here, and they've been very actively engaged in this bill and offered to come and share some input from their perspective. If Katie, you'd like to share with us, welcome.
Sure thing. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, everybody, for having me. Yeah, like Heather said, my name's Katie. I am the Senior Region Grassroots Lead for the Heart Association. So I work with Laura Hale, who is our Government Relations Director, who some of you might know, in Pennsylvania. But I'm also based in Philadelphia. And I've been here the whole time that we've had the tax. And it's been, I mean, for anecdotal purposes, it's been awesome. It's been really, really beneficial to us as a city. We, have really, been able to see a lot of benefit that's come from it. We have actually, it's funny, my grocery store that's right across the street from me, who used to be very unhappy and used to send out all these like nasty messages and petitions about how much they didn't like it. First of all, 6 years in, they don't say anything about it anymore. Second of all, right across the street from it is a park that was completely unusable. It wasn't graded right. It just flooded all the time. You could not use this park. And now, thanks to the sugar sweetened beverages that are being sold just across the street, we now have a park there. There's also been no decrease in, there's a lot of concerns about jobs. There's not been any measurable decrease in jobs in grocery stores or anything. And actually, there's been an increase in jobs, particularly in lower income neighborhoods, because that's where you're getting a lot of the daycare programs and stuff there. So you're actually adding jobs in that way. So just from an anecdotal perspective, it's been very beneficial here from what I've seen. And I'm just really excited to work on making this statewide in Maryland. As a lot of you know, I'm sure there's a big financial downfall that's happening in Maryland. And we're really concerned about, how we're going to pay for a lot of services. I mean, including services for kids with developmental disabilities. I mean, it's pretty serious. So, a lot of this is going to go into the general fund. So we're not going to have a specific idea of like, okay, it's going to go to this, it's going to go to that. But one of the things that we're really excited about doing with it is helping address the school meals issue and to really tighten up that missing middle gap when it comes to school meals and making sure that we're having those school meals funded for kids who really need it. including those who are just kind of on that edge, who, you know, maybe things were all right in September, but it's a little different in February. So we're just real excited about this. You know, we know on top of all of that, you know, while studies, you know, as you know, take a long time, one of the things that we have seen here in Philly is that in the past 6 years, the one measurable thing that we've seen that we believe is attributed to this is that there's a marked decrease, and I can send the papers on this, but there's a marked decrease in gestational diabetes for pregnant women in Philadelphia. So it's been real positive. I think it's going to be really positive for Maryland, and we're just really excited to see this happen.
Thank you so much for that insight. Super helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to say, and I can put this in the chat or I can send it to Heather and she can send it out. We will be having, if anybody's interested, we're having a lobby day on this issue on March 5th. And that'll be at the Maryland Inn in Annapolis. So I'll send out the information, but if anybody's interested in joining us, we'd love to have you for that.
Great. Thanks so much, Katie. So we're open and interested in hearing input from others on the call. If there are perspectives that you've seen from your own organizations or from community partners, welcome the input on your thoughts or any questions that would be of interest for us to gather additional information around.
Thank you, Heather. Is there any other, anybody else want to weigh in on this bill or have questions? All right, seeing none, those are the two bills that we were going to discuss in detail today. I'm going to just go review some bills that we've talked about in the past and talk about the status of some of those bills. One we talked about in our last session back on February 10th was the expansion of the community eligibility CEP program. Just a heads up that there is a Senate hearing on that on Wednesday and a House hearing on March 5th. An update on the food deserts work group. I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in on this. There had been a suggestion during the Senate hearing on this, which was back on February 6th, that the FSRC would have a role in conducting this study. I think it has since been determined that the amendment that would have provided for a specific role for the FSRC is not going to be included in the version of this bill that advances, if it does advance. So I don't know if anybody else has any insight on it, but I know that that had been an item of concern, but I don't think this is going to be foisted on the FSRC. By the way, I forgot to mention for the previous one, the CEP bill, if you want to submit testimony, this would be the last day to do so for the Senate. Looking at some hearings we were tracking for last week, we had a hearing in the Senate on the Family Investment Program and Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Benefits Child Support Bill, which would change the calculation for monthly benefits for FIP and SNAP to exclude child support. All positive testimony in the Senate hearing, which was on February 19th, including, I think, some folks on this call today, a representative from Legal Aid, from the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, and a bunch of different advocacy organizations. House hearing is coming up on the cross-file version of the bill tomorrow, the 25th. Hunger-Free Campus Grant Program for higher institutions of higher education had a hearing in the Senate last week on the 21st. No questions from the committee or opposition. I know that Maryland Hunger Solutions was there to testify in support. Oyster shucking. Maryland Agricultural and Resource-Based Industry Development Corporation. Steve McHenry, who I believe might be here, may or may not be here, testified in support. There was no testimony in opposition, and we know that this bill got out of its House committee with a favorable report. It was in the Environment and Transportation Committee, so it should be coming to the House floor sometime in the next week or so. Yes, I see a hand.
I was just going to ask if Steve had something to add because I saw he came off camera. But hi, Steve.
No, Ben covered it well. The bill is moving without any problem. Senate hearing is in a week or so.
Good to hear. Thank you, Steve. The property tax credit bill for urban agriculture property, which we discussed on our last call on the 10th, had a hearing in the House. A lot of representatives from various organizations testified in support. Some individuals directly involved with urban agriculture, a representative from the Prince George's County Farm Bureau, Dr. Range, who may or may not be here, was there to testify, and Rachel Jones, who I also may or may not be here, was there to testify in support. The testimony in opposition came from Justin Fiore from the Maryland Municipal League. So MML is opposed to this bill because of the change to an optional property tax credit that local governments had already agreed to, and they are against changing that provision. So that is what happened with House Bill 907. Had a hearing in the Senate on the solid waste disposal surcharge and wasted food reduction and diversion fund and grant program bill. Bunch of FSRC All-Stars testified in support. There's a question about who would pay the proposed fees from Senator Watson. And just based on the way the statute is worded, it would be the waste haulers for paying the proposed fees. Food, forests, and foraging had a hearing in the Senate. There was favorable testimony from Tierney Acosta, president and founder of the Permaculture Club at Montgomery College, and Ashley Triplett Peltzman from the Department of Natural Resources. Also, a representative from the Forest Service testified in support. There were a couple of clarifying questions, but there was no organized opposition to this bill in the Senate. And then the Chesapeake Bay Legacy Act, which we talked about this a couple of meetings ago, concerning the LEAF program, Maryland Leaders in Environmentally Engaged Farming bill. Kevin Addix from Maryland Department of Agriculture, a representative from DNR, somebody from the deputy legislative officer from the governor's office, since this is one of the governor's own legislative proposals, testified in support. And then there are a few individuals, including Jeannie Hadaway Riccio, who's a former delegate and also used to work for DNR in the Hogan administration, testified in support of amendments from the Talbot Watermen's Association. Yes. Annika?
Ben, was there any opposition to the Chesapeake Bay Legacy Act?
I'm sorry. There wasn't any direct opposition, but there were a couple of people requesting amendments. I can get more information to you as to specifically what they were requesting, but we had a couple of individuals testifying in favor of the bill, but with amendments.
Ben, I can probably offer some additional insight. The bill contains two major divisions. One is the agricultural component with the LEAF program. Seems to be broad support for that. There are a whole slew of amendments on the fisheries side of the bill. And my understanding is that DNR and the watermen's groups are working through those. I'm not sure there's consent yet from the watermen's groups, but the word late last week was it sounded like things were moving in a positive direction so that the watermen's groups could be supportive of the amended bill dealing with the fisheries component.
Thank you so much, Steve. Always appreciate your insight. Any other questions on Chesapeake Bay Legacy Act? I realize there's a lot of information. This is what happens when you're in the thick of the legislative session. We go 2 weeks between calls. So, yeah, Annika.
Is there a House hearing for it yet?
Let me... 1 second. Yeah, so the House hearing is scheduled for March 6th at 1 p.m.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I think the bottom part of the slide got cut off, which hopefully I can fix for the next call. But yes, there is a hearing in the House for this bill on March 6th. Other questions? Anne Arundel County property tax credit for supermarkets. I think we talked about this in one of our earlier calls. Received a favorable report from Budget and Tax in the Senate, so this will be heading to the Senate floor. There was a House hearing on the cross-file bill, no questions or opposition. Department of Human Services Federal Commodity Supplemental Food Program Administration passed the House unanimously. So the House version of the bill is now on the Senate side. And there was also a hearing in the Senate on this bill with no testimony in opposition. So a good sign for this bill that it passed unanimously in the House. We have a list of priority legislation that we've discussed on these calls that has passed its original chamber. Maryland Farms and Family Fund, both cross-filed versions of the bill have passed their original chamber. And have crossed over to the opposite chamber. Same for Department of Agriculture, Maryland Agricultural Commission and Young Farmers Bill, passed unanimously in the House and Senate. The bill to change definitions in the Food System Resilience Council passed with 9 no votes in the House. That is now on the Senate side. And baby food labeling, the statement regarding toxic heavy metal testing passed unanimously in the House as well. And then the Department of Human Services Federal Commodity Supplemental Food Program Administration, as we mentioned, passed unanimously in the House. And then a couple of bills, just wanted to quickly draw your attention to a couple of bills that have been withdrawn by the sponsor. The On-Farm Home Processing License Bill, Revenue Limit Bill, withdrawn by sponsors in both the House and the Senate. And then we had briefly discussed a bill on reforming food and milk product labeling, and that too has been withdrawn by the sponsor. Annika.
Martin, did you say that you had some insight on why the on-farm processing bill was withdrawn?
Yes, absolutely. I'll take a couple steps back. I'll offer this history starting back in December when the Governor's Intergovernmental Commission on Agriculture's new-ish value-added and agritourism subcommittee met. That subcommittee discussed some actionable items with our state partners, particularly the Department of Health, about what types of changes could be made to the on-farm processing license external to legislation. They had agreed to take a look at farm ownership and possibly being able to add leasing to that language, as well as revisiting the revenue caps. Through these efforts and discussions, of course, legislative session began. Some local Farm Bureau chapters expressed concern with a revenue cap on their ability to sell farm-raised meats. So Senate Bill 481 was proposed. Through the early stages of the legislative session, we were asked to discuss this matter with MDH and the bill sponsor. Maryland Department of Health has proposed some regulatory policy changes at the agency level through COMAR that satisfied the needs of the bill sponsor. So we are expecting Maryland Department of Health to have some proposed legislation that will go through the state level public policy process, which will include hopefully at least a month for public input. But what we're looking at as far as changes to the on-farm home processing license is to match cottage food cap at $50,000 for the on-farm home processing license functions that include the jams, jellies, pickles in a farmer's home kitchen, while also completely exempting the meat and cheese sold off farms that were processed at a third-party facility, while also adding lease to the language to benefit both owned and leased farms. Now, this is simply just a start, and if Heather and I learned anything last week, it's that there's still many caveats that pose a lot of challenges with the way this license is worded and more importantly interpreted. So we'll definitely have some more information when that proposed legislation is posted on MDH and have a better understanding of the timeline. But that's why Senate Bill 481 was withdrawn, because many of the changes that can happen here are through COMAR policy change. And I'll handle any questions anyone might have on that.
Martin, thank you so much for joining us, especially after I just kind of grabbed you in a hallway on Friday and asked if you could be here. So I really appreciate your being so responsive and supportive of all the behind the scenes info. Are there questions for Martin or other perspectives on what was shared? Okay. Oh, Annika.
Sorry, I have a lot of questions today, apparently. So Martin, did you say that there is like a path forward to match that cottage law threshold?
Yes, my understanding is that the intent would be to, through a proposed regulation change, to match the cottage food revenue cap for the on-farm home processing license while exempting the meat and cheese that are also listed under that. It's under statute, it's recognized under statute, but we all know how confusing on-farm processing is to include meat and cheese that aren't processed on the farm. So the meat and cheese that were always just refrigerated or frozen and kept on the farm were also capped with that revenue cap. So those products, because they're a separate list item, will hopefully be exempt completely. So we can encourage farm-raised meats and pasture-raised cheeses. And then lease will be added to the owned language, but that will also, again, be public process. We'll make sure that the committee and the full council knows what that timeline looks like. Because like I said, there still seems to be some challenges with this license and what it is intended to do. But this is definitely a step towards opening it up, and definitely will remove some significant hurdles, particularly the leased land access. We've run into a lot of challenges dealing with farmers and that language.
Thank you so much, Martin. Anything else before we move on? We have a list of bills here with upcoming hearings. Some of those we've mentioned in our presentation today. Others may be of interest to some of you. I know Annika will send out these slides after this meeting is over. Quick update on the budget. So this week in both the House and the Senate, there are going to be hearings on the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, what they call the BRFA in Annapolis. So this is the bill that adjusts previously mandated spending. So if the governor is required to include X amount of spending in a budget for a program through fiscal year 2027, and the General Assembly wants to cut off that funding for the next 2 fiscal years, they would do so in this bill. So it's a bill to try and reconcile with the governor and the General Assembly's recommended level of spending and revenue. So I expect hearings for the BRFA. So we have a House hearing on Thursday and a Senate hearing on Friday to be pretty contentious given the state's budget position. And then separately, the budget bill, which simply appropriates new spending. There have been no hearing dates scheduled for that. I know there have been hearings on the subcommittee level. But we'll keep everybody posted as to what happens with both the budget and the BRFA. we're close to the deadline for the final date of introduction of bills without the requirement that the rules be suspended. So not going to get a lot of new bills being introduced after the 3rd of March. Crossover day is March 17th and Sine Die coming up on April 7th. And that's all I got. And thanks everybody for bearing with me. I know this is a lot of information. Annika will send out the slides. And if you have any questions on anything, please do not hesitate to reach out.
Thanks so much, Ben. I'm curious, since we have a little bit of time, if anyone has any updates on legislation that they're following or anything that they would want to share from their organizations. And I'll go ahead, Nancy.
Well, I was just going to say we are following a bill, and I have to look up the number, but that will be heard on Friday in both the House and the Senate. And it's related to the Public Service Commission and solar and the use of ag land. And it's pretty, at least on the Eastern Shore, it's pretty contentious. So there are hearings in both of the chambers. I think they're at 1:30 on Friday afternoon.
Yep. So Friday afternoon, 1:30 p.m. in the House. This is House Bill 1036, Public Utilities Generating Stations, Generation and Siting, Renewable Energy Certainty Act, the Crossfile Bill. Yes, thank you, Annika. And the Senate also has a hearing Friday at 1:30.
Yeah, this is a huge issue for the agricultural community. Right at the top of the list of bills to oppose.
Lindsay? Yeah.
Lindsay, if you're talking, we can't hear you. I think you're muted. All right. Lindsay, we'll put you on a holding pattern until the mic issues are sorted. Does anyone have any additional thoughts? Thanks so much, Steve, for weighing in, and Nancy for raising that as well. I'm curious if other agencies or organizations are following this or weighing in. Well, Nancy and Steve, we will encourage you to keep us posted and up to date if there are things that the FSRC should be aware of. Ben, was that it for our formal
Yes, it was.
agenda items? Okay, great. Yeah, Annika?
Just the last one that I would highlight that I don't think we've talked about is the alcoholic beverage sales in grocery stores bill. I know that that may be of interest to some, just because of the implications it could have for healthy food priority areas. If anyone has any insight into that one. The hearing was last week. And if not, that's okay. And Michelle has her hand raised.
And Lindsay raised her hand again.
Yeah, I think she's having mute issues, but
Yeah, Lindsay did text me her question, so I'm here to help her out. She said, "Can you ask if anyone is tracking the proposal to cut SMATIC's budget?
I was gonna ask the same question. Thank you, Lindsay.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. I know that there has been some email traffic and engagement related to proposed budget cuts. It's not anything that I have additional information on beyond what's been shared. But I invite anyone who's on the call who has additional information or has independently weighed in and wants to share their perspective, that would be welcomed and appreciated.
I can just tell you what the BRFA proposes. It's proposing SMATIC has mandatory funding of $1 million a year from the Cigarette Restitution Fund. And the governor's budget is balanced in part by reductions taken in the BRFA, which we previously talked about. Those bills are being heard on Thursday and Friday. The governor's recommendation is to cut SMATIC by $250,000 per year for the next 4 years. So we go from $1 million currently to $750,000 in fiscal 26, then 500,000, 250, and then finally being zeroed out in the last year. So that is the language that is contained in the BRFA relating to SMATIC. And Shelby and crew are mounting a major effort to try to prevent at least future cuts, if not the reduction proposed for fiscal 26.
Thanks so much, Steve. And I'm curious, is it just, is it a cut specified at a particular programmatic area, or is it just from the allocation from the fund?
The major source of funding for SMATIC, which is a division of the Tri-County Council for Southern Maryland, is from the Cigarette Restitution Fund. The source of that money is from the Master Tobacco Settlement dating back to 1999. So every year there are funds flowing into Maryland from the cigarette companies. Those funds are beginning to decline as fewer people smoke. And so the bulk of those monies go to fund programs at the health department. But there's been $1 million set aside for the last year or so. And it goes back several years that funding has gone to SMATIC from the Cigarette Restitution Fund. So current law requires that $1 million be budgeted a year for SMATIC. That law is being proposed to be changed, so the funding is phased out over 4 years.
Mm-hmm. So it's more a cut tied to revenue limitations.
That's what the administration would argue. Yeah.
Thank you. Nancy, I know you just went off camera, but it seemed like you were about to say something, so I wanted to create space if so. And Steve, thanks so much for that input. I really appreciate it. All right. Well, Lindsay, hopefully that got at your question. And Michelle, thank you for being an intermediary there. But if there are additional comments or questions, please feel free to pop those in the chat. And I see Nancy giving some additional information about the budget reconciliation and financing work that's happening this Friday for the SMATIC hearing. So thanks, Nancy. Other legislative issues that are on your radar that you're weighing in on or internally exploring? If not, we will be back next Monday for another discussion, and certainly we'll be monitoring what is happening this week in the hearings and any additional changes or activity. Again, yes, echoing Nancy's appreciation for Ben and Annette for all of the hard work that they are doing to keep us informed and watching lots and lots of hearings. And that is time very well spent and much appreciated. And Annika, I just always want to express appreciation for everything that you do for all of us here at the FSRC and beyond. So that's all from me. I don't know if there's anything remaining on the agenda or anybody
No,
has
thank you.
anything to share. Yeah.
Heather, there's one other bill, and it occurs to me this might be of interest to this group. Legislation was introduced by the Maryland Department of Planning relating to new state planning principles for local governments to follow when putting together their comprehensive plans. We raised a concern with the department and the hearing committees that today a little over 1/2 of the state's land area is privately owned farm and forest land. And there was no principle dedicated to, protecting working lands and open space and that sort of thing. So we did reach an agreement with the department that has passed the Senate and Senate Bill 266. And I believe the House subcommittee will be working on the bill in the E&T committee this week. House Bill 286, that at least in the principle relating to land, that they recognize the need to consider farms, forests, and also fisheries, as it turns out, in that principle. Previously, there were planning visions that recognized the need for rural working agricultural and forest land, and those are being repealed. But we felt that there should be some recognition in state and local planning of the needs to plan for agriculture and forestry. And then I mentioned fisheries was added by the Senate as well. So Senate Bill 266, House Bill 286.
Yeah, thanks so much for flagging that, Steve. It is shared in the chat by Annika. So thank you for
Yeah, I
putting
should have
that
thought
in.
of that sooner. Sorry to be late mentioning that.
No, that's great. Thank you, Steve. And I'm curious, does this apply to all counties or planning departments?
Yes.
Universally?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So the department is going to be issuing guidance manuals around each of the 8 new principles. And so the principle, and there's one on economy and there's another on land. And so I expect now there will be some recognition of working farm and forest land mentioned in the 2 manuals that will go with the land principle and also the economy principle, if that makes sense.
In my experience, it seems like each local jurisdiction approaches planning related to food systems very differently. And so do you think that this could have the effect of being more intentional with the planning as it intersects?
Well, I would encourage the council to be vigilant and perhaps engage the department as it is putting together its new manuals on these topics. And maybe there's an opportunity for the council to have input into what goes into those manuals around the new 8 planning principles.
Mm-hmm. And is it defined in the legislation, or does the bill task planning with creating it after it's passed?
I don't know if the bill directly tasks planning to do the manuals, but that's what they publicly stated they're going to be doing around each of the new 8 principles.
Very interesting.
You look at the Senate bill, it has the latest language. Senate Bill 266.
Yeah.
And I'll just add to that briefly. So as Steve mentioned, and thanks Steve for catching that, the 8 themes that were identified are already being discussed in what were formed as technical advisory committees. MDA is represented on, I believe, 4 of the 8, which include environment and economy, and however they've broken all of these down, and land preservation is involved in a lot of those conversations as well. So yeah, I think this legislation is to kind of give the go-ahead for the establishment of these as formal principles, but they are starting the legwork on it now, and we are part of the conversation. But like Steve said, there's definitely some words, key buzzwords that are getting cut out to streamline this a little bit. And so thanks for catching that, Steve.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much, Steve. Okay, great. And thanks, Summer, for noting that MDEM is on one of the committees as well. I think it, just from my own personal perspective, it reads as capturing a lot of the key issue areas and calling them out specifically, but food is not one of them. And often it's embedded throughout, but as a subset of other issue areas. And so I think that is definitely something for us to share some insights around for how food could be potentially centered. So that's great. Thank you. All right, well, Ben, I guess we can add that one to the tracker, please. And stay tuned on that.
All right.
And I see no other hands or comments or recommendations. So I think we can give everyone 5 minutes of one of the first few sunny days we've had in a while back.
Thanks, Heather.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks, everyone.
Great. It's wonderful to be with everyone. We'll see you next Monday, and continue please to share resources or flag bills or anything else that you think we should be covering together. Take care.